Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we're very lucky to have our esteemed English teacher, Mr. Robert Foley. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Neil, good seeing you.
Yes,
You
it's
look
very nice.
just about the same, except the hair is faded a little bit.
Just a drop for both of us. I wanted to start with how you began college. First, you decided to go to Albany State. What happened when you were there, and how come you only lasted one semester?
Going to Albany, I wanted to be a teacher. If you looked at my yearbook, it would say, going to NYU wants to be an engineer. I have no idea how that got into the yearbook. Went to Albany State with the intention of being a math teacher, actually, and decided pretty quickly that I wanted to switch to English because I just didn't want to teach the same problems every year. I could change books in English, whatever. At any rate, my career at Albany State lasted to about December of my freshman year, when I developed an infected hair follicle, which turned into a nightmare that lasted for 3 months. I broke out like the ghost of Hamlet's father when the doctor gave me penicillin. My mother came up and she dragged me out of there. The doctor up there had addicted me to cortisone, which they didn't understand how to wean you off at the time. It was until my birthday in the end of March when I sort of recovered from the whole episode. I had no inclination to revisit Albany at that point. It was the middle of the school year. I couldn't really go to a school at that point. So I went to Grosset and Dunlap and got a job doing the thing that I did best, which was editing. I didn't have too many skills. Labor-wise, I had no skills. And I got a job editing little golden books and wonder books, the little train that puffed and puffed its way up the hill. Stayed there, loved it. I had more money in my pocket, than I could ever have dreamed of because I was working overtime and doing great stuff there. Wound up being there for almost 4 years and wound up getting pushed up to the point where I was editing the Universal Library, which were classics that were being republished. In the meantime, I did, in the following September, went to Hunter, and started as a non-matriculating student. The difference being nobody took attendance of non-matriculated students. You just went if you wanted to go. I wasn't particularly interested in going. I was a notorious cutter in my high school English class, where I constantly was working on the school magazine, and the teacher, who was my English teacher, predominant English teacher, was the editor of the magazine, so she had no problem letting me go into the office and work. I did all the reading, and I aced the tests in English, no problem. I was a great student, knew grammar from the time I was in the cradle, I think. Although, I wasn't that great in all my other subjects, but I was competent. My mother forced me to be competent. She was like, don't. It was the time when if I went home and said, the teacher said, I would get whacked, and then she would ask, what did the teacher say? And why did the teacher say that? Anyhow, I was a pretty good student. And I non-matriculated for about 2.5 years while I was working at Grosset and Dunlap. The best part of that was nobody took attendance. So of course I didn't go to classes. I did the reading, went to take the tests. In the meantime, I worked at Grosset and Dunlap, which was on 23rd Street. Hunter was on 68th Street. In between was the Great White Way and the Metropolitan Opera. And it was too tempting to stop at one of those theaters on the way to school, and I never got to the classes. But I survived. I only went full-time, really, when I had to do student teaching and some of my education courses, which, were worthless for the most part, but they were obligatory.
So you graduate and you worked for a semester at Gorton as a sub. Then you were sort of out of a job, and then you got a call. And now you're on a full-time tenured track teaching at Gorton High School. And one of your classes was with academically challenged students. And they had a terrible curriculum that you found a way to make more relevant. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. I replaced, I have to say this though, I replaced Gertrude Lynch when I went back as a permanent teacher. She had passed on. And she was the prototype, I think I've mentioned this, but she was the prototype of the teacher in Greece. The librettist and the composer of Greece both went to Gorton, and it was, it was Gorton High School that was really being depicted in the first stages of Greece. Anyhow, I picked up her program. She had the best academic classes, and because she was the chairman of the department, but she also had 2 terminal classes. They called them terminals, which is hardly an appropriate name today. But into the terminal class went every conceivable miscreant, shall we say. And Mary Galder, who was the chairman of the department, brings me back to the closet of that room. I traveled to that room, opens the closet and said, "These are the books you're supposed to be teaching these kids." Well, I looked at the books after she left. There was, amongst other things, Jane Eyre, The Idylls of the King, Ethan Frome, the climax of which occurs when a cat knocks the dish off the cupboard, pickle dish off the cupboard, Moby Dick, things that these kids would never read in a million years or be able to read. So I went to the old mimeograph machine, locked up the closet, and started mimeographing really naturalistic, realistic short stories and things of that sort, which had all kinds of, I guess, street language and street situations in them that these kids could relate to. And eventually we got along fine. The first day was a little touch. One kid came to raise a chair over my head, and I didn't know any better. I took the chair out of his hand and brought it down on his head. No discipline problems after that. And I got to relate to those kids. And honestly, you as a teacher probably feel somewhat the same thing. It is sometimes much more rewarding to teach the groundlings, as I call them, as opposed to the academically unchallenged. And anyhow, we made it through, and Gorton became my home very quickly. I stayed. I was very happy. I was never observed. Mr. Kavanaugh, I knew through a cousin, so he never bothered me, and it was a very happy time.
Well, part of the reason you don't get bothered is because there are no problems going on.
But that's exactly, if you're not in the office complaining about this kid or that kid, or there's no riot in your room,
right?
You've settled everything by breaking a chair over a kid's head, not knowing you shouldn't do that. Yeah, that's smooth. That's all they care about with the administrators.
Right. What do you remember about the class of '67 and the production of King Lear?
Well, King Lear was a play that I would never have done without the class of '67. I was pretty much a novice as a director. I had started at Gorton 2 years before doing Annie Get Your Gun, which I fell into by total accident. Again, my department chairman, Mary Galder, came and said, "We need someone to work lights. Could you do that?" I didn't know anything about working lights. I said, okay, because I was non-tenure. And I found that all you had to do was like take a spotlight and put it on whoever was talking or singing. And so I said I could manage that. And then in the middle of that production, the director, who was a science teacher, had a nervous breakdown of some sort and walked out of the production and walked out of the school and never came back. So they needed a director, and Sandy Siegelstein, who was the music director, said, "Well, you know all the blocking from being in the gallery with the spotlight." Says, "Could you come down and direct?" So I said, "Well, okay." And I made my way through it. I knew, I had always gone to theater, and So I made my way through it and I loved it, but I hated doing musicals. I never enjoyed them because you were doing them for 2.5 months, and these rhyme doggerel things were fixed in your mind, and they pretty much, except for some seminal musicals like West Side Story or something like that, most of them were pretty much the same. And someone mentioned that there was the Coal Bunker Theater, which Mildred Streeter had started many years before I got there, which had fallen into disrepair, that it was down in the basement and being in total disuse. And I said, well, let me go down there and see what's going on. And there was down there a little 100-seat off-Broadway theater. So I brought some kids down. We cleaned out all the dust and the mold and the garbage that was down there, resurrected the thing, brought some lights down, and I started directing plays down there. A lot of avant-garde stuff that would never have sailed on the main stage, let's put it that way, language-wise or content-wise. But since only 30 people would come, nobody ever said anything. They enjoyed it. They came because they knew who Edward Albee was, or they knew who Fernando Arrabal was, or these crazy playwrights of the absurd. And then someone said, well, why don't you try directing a straight play upstairs? And I came up, this was, I guess, in '66, and I came up and I decided to do Oedipus Rex and Antigone. And it was pretty successful. It worked pretty well. I went on instinct. I cast it pretty well. And I discovered there that there was real talent there. And much of that cast, I was sort of in my subconscious, grooming to do something bigger. And the next year, your year, King Lear came about, and much of this cast from Oedipus Rex transferred right into King Lear as seniors. And it worked. I mean, at this point, they're probably old enough to play the parts, but there's something about old age that Lear, of course, deals with. Everyone knows what it deals with. But there is something about young kids, when you teach them acting, they are able to relate to themselves and their own problems, and they're able to relate to old people. They cannot relate to middle age. You ask them to do a Stephen Sondheim play, and they're totally at sea. They have no idea what the psychology or the motivation of these characters are. So anyhow, King Lear went very successfully, and it became sort of, I guess, a seminal moment in the lives of many of the people who were in it.
Absolutely, it did.
And it was certainly a seminal point in my life and set me right off. I loved directing at that point, to the point where by the time I ended my teaching career at Lincoln, I was directing 6 or 7 plays a year and running the Performing Arts magnet.
And that was in 1997 when you finally left Lincoln. What was the best part of teaching for you?
Always the kids, of course, and getting to get into their skulls and getting to mold them and sort of perhaps be a role model for them in some way or another that you're not even aware of. The happiest part comes years later when people you don't even remember or vaguely remember will suddenly contact you, and it happens quite frequently, and say, I remember this, I remember that. Thank you, and that's the most gratifying part, of course. Teaching also brought me out of my shell. I was, though anyone who's watching this would not really believe that, but I was an extremely introverted person. You put me in a room with 10 people whom I didn't know, and I would go off into a corner and, brood, as it were, not wanting to interplay. But put me in front of an audience or in front of a classroom, and I somehow become animated and take off. And it did bring me, it changed my personality a lot.
One of the things that we're not going to have time to talk about is the fact that after you retired in '97, you became a published author. And it's a very different world living as an author as opposed to, being a teacher with people all the time. How did that feel, living in this world that you make up all the characters?
The introvert came back. I could sit down. I didn't have an audience in front of me. I could sit down and create my audience and talk to them and talk to the characters. And uh, I never took notes like from teaching, from incidents, but I had a very, very good memory for things that happened. In the first true book I wrote, which was The Consequences of Playing God, Tales from Lingor High School, which is a compilation of Lincoln and Gorton, as you know, most people have figured out. Uh, as you write, incidents come back and things come back, and virtually everything in that book, as highly satirical as it is.
The idea that, you know, you made such a difference in so many of our lives is something that I know my classmates would be happy to say, thank you very much, Mr. Foley. It really made a difference for us. And, you know, one of the nice things about being a teacher is, you know, we live on by some of the wonderful things that our students do. And you have a lot to be proud of with regard to that. So for all of my classmates, I want to say thank you. And I hope you were able to get to the reunion in June of 22. I know it's possible that you can and maybe not, but everybody would love seeing you.
Well, we'll see what June brings. Usually we're in South Carolina where we have a home in Hilton Head. If you want to have the reunion down here.
That's a good place to end on. Maybe we'll all see you in South Carolina.
Right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Neil. I appreciate it. And hello to everybody.